He went through different phases as a child by loving this or that. But I think, I have to admit, in the end, I ended up probably being a sort of pony-mad child.
It was supposed to be a tranquil evening of music and tradition, a secret royal concert held in the gleaming rooms of Windsor Castle, the type of affair where string quartets hum quietly beneath crystal chandeliers, visitors sip champagne between rounds of polite applause, and royal children, dressed to perfection, take turns showing their well-cultivated abilities. No press, there are no cameras, only family, music, and a tinge of generational pride. Prince Louie, who was developing into a smart and articulate little kid, had been planning for this night for weeks. Louie had grown in love with the piano thanks to the gentle instruction of his mother, whose own passion for the arts mirrored that of the late Princess Diana. His fingers, still little and timid, glided through simple classical compositions, and while he wasn't striving for perfection, there was an undeniable purity to his playing. But what happened that evening challenged more than just the innocence of a royal recital. It would reveal the silent cruelty that still exists behind palace walls, the subtle humiliations disguised as laughter, and the tacit rule that not all guests respect the sacredness of royal upbringing. A world-renowned pianist sat in the front row, only a few feet from the keyboard, adding dignity and pride to the event. He was invited by the palace to serve as both tutor and performer, and he had the reputation of a genius as well as the tongue of a cynic. And after Louis finished his little speech, concluding with a modest look toward his parents, that guest leaned sideways, smirked, and muttered something he had no idea would transform the room. "Cute fingers," he said. "Shame they're wasted." A little laugh followed. Perhaps it was a joke. Perhaps it was hubris. But what he didn't realize, and couldn't have foreseen, was that Princess Charlotte heard every word. Her brother's triumphant moment is disregarded in a single line. Something changed at that very instant. She did not weep. She did not run. She was watching. She proceeded. Then, slowly and methodically, she stood. Charlotte's actions had a long-lasting impact on the palace, but it was also the result of her silent transformation. A little girl reared in the shadow of her legacy, a daughter of Kate, Diana's grandchild. And on that night, in a room full of titles and egos, Charlotte, not the crown, struck the last note. It had all the hallmarks of a beautiful Windsor evening. Lights streaming over the gold-trimmed ceiling, visitors dressed in velvet and silk, and the silent expectancy that usually surrounds royal occasions involving children. However, this was no ordinary gathering. This was a carefully chosen performance, an annual event Kate had discreetly reintroduced in recent years as a tribute to Diana's love of music and a reminder to the younger generation that greatness begins with passion rather than obligation. The royal family met inside the Queen's drawing room, which had been turned for the evening into a little music theater, for what many considered as a delightful family custom. A chosen audience, including extended royals, aristocratic friends, and a few cultural elites, sat on rows of fine mahogany seats. At the front stood a beautiful baby grand piano brought from Vienna, its ivory keys ready for the touch of small fingers. Prince Louis, dressed in a neat blue jacket with a crimson pocket square as a tribute to William's old boyhood style, sat in the front row, eyes wide and posture straight. He had been practicing for several weeks. Every morning after breakfast and every evening before bed, Kate kneels next to him and gently corrects his posture. Music had become their private link, a haven of tranquility in a kingdom where formality sometimes stifled inquiry. The program began nicely. A visiting kid prodigy started things off with a cello solo. Then, with elegance beyond her years, Princess Charlotte delivered a brief poem she had written herself, a moving piece about bravery inspired by a recent school trip. George remained backstage, opting out this year to cheer his siblings from the sidelines. And then it was Louis's time. He rose up, straightened his blazer, and proceeded with obvious difficulty to the piano. The audience offered a warm, supportive clap. Kate's smile shone throughout the room. William offered an approving nod, but behind all the formality, one could sense it. This was a watershed moment for the young prince. His hands shook slightly as he pressed them on the keys. The melody began with a little Mozart piece, light and gentle, which he had learned in the previous month. Each note was purposeful, some a bit too soft, some slightly out of time, but the heart was there. His foot tapped uncomfortably under the bench. At the end, he paused and glanced up, seeking acceptance not just from his parents, but also from the whole room. The crowd replied with polite applause and a few appreciative comments. However, not all eyes were friendly. The guest of honor sat in the center of the front row, a worldwide renowned pianist whose career had brought him both Grammys and infamy. He had been invited not just for status, but also to motivate the pupils. Instead of encouraging, he turned to the ambassador beside him, smiled, and said a venomous whisper. "Cute fingers," he murmured, his voice like glass. "Shame they're wasted." The ambassador chuckled uneasily. One of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting squinted, uncertain whether she had heard right, but Charlotte overheard it, every syllable. And unlike the grown-ups around her, she did not dismiss it. She had been staring at Louie earnestly, her hands clasped in her lap. His achievement was hers, and they created a sibling friendship based on reverence rather than competitiveness. Charlotte, who had previously told her mother she aspired to be a brave lady like Granny Diana, had witnessed her brother doing something heroic, and now that bravery was being derided, as if it were a show in the town square, she gently moved her head toward the piano. Her lips remained still, but her eyes narrowed, not with tears, but with calculating. She knew more about the game than the majority of the adults in the room, despite being only 9. In the royal family, you are taught to be silent, to smile, let things slide. But Charlotte hadn't fully absorbed those teachings. Not yet. She'd learnt something else. Loyalty. In that huge chamber full of titles, adulation, and hidden harshness, a seed was sown. The root of a silent rebellion, not against the throne, but against the casual disdain that accompanied it. Nobody saw her stand. Not yet. Charlotte, although being a child, inherited something considerably greater than applause, as the pianist quickly realized. She'd inherited the fire. Princess Charlotte has always stood out in the royal society, where every gesture and word is polished and pre-approved, not by rebelling noisily, but by carefully selecting when and for whom to breach the rules. She's never been the quiet one. Charlotte demonstrated a flair that etiquette texts and royal managers could not extinguish. That light flared hottest when her family was under danger. Her code, however unwritten, was unbreakable. Devotion came before formality. Charlotte has risen to her brother's defense before. At last year's Trooping the Color, during a private lunch inside Buckingham Palace, a royal cousin joked that Louis would probably end up as a royal mascot instead of a real prince. Charlotte, without missing a beat, turned to him and calmly replied, "He'll still do more than most people who say nothing but laugh." The room fell silent. Even Anne had raised an eyebrow. Kate never chastised her. Instead, later that evening, she softly drew Charlotte aside and told her, "You have your grandmother's courage. Use it carefully." Charlotte was doing just that once she returned to Windsor's recital room. She hadn't spoken anything yet, but her body language had changed. Her stance, which was typically correct and princess-like, had turned as rigid as stone. She sat stiff, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the musician who had just insulted her brother. Nobody else had reacted. The grown-ups had either missed the statement or feigned to have. Even William's meticulously poised visage revealed just the smallest trace of a clenched jaw. But Charlotte was different. She did not have decades of royal indoctrination embedded in her spine. She had instinct and love. As the next musician, a shy violinist from a family acquaintance, ascended the stage, Charlotte made her entrance. She stood up quietly, without looking for permission from her parents, not suddenly or disruptively, just enough to attract notice. Her sneakers clicked lightly across the floor as she went to the front of the room, and every head turned slowly in her way. The pianist, in the middle of a conversation with the envoy, looked up to see the young princess coming. He imagined she was intrigued, possibly influenced by his reputation. His smile returned, broad and false. Charlotte paused in front of him, folding her hands carefully. "I like my brother's piece," she stated simply. "Did you?" The room froze. The question carried the weight of a sword wrapped in silk. The pianist blinked, evidently taken off guard. "Oh yeah, delicious," he stammered. Very charming. Charlotte cocked her head. Because I heard you mention that his fingers were wasted. Do you usually say things like that about children? Gasps rang out from the rear of the room. One of the ladies in waiting discontinued her program. Kate straightened in her chair. Camilla sat several seats back, squinted her eyes, and leaned forward, feeling things slipping out of her grasp. Charlotte continued, her voice level, yet tinged with something older than her years. Mummy says people who make others feel small are usually afraid of something. The pianist opened his lips, then closed it. There was no elegant exit. And with that, she curtsied, shallow, confident, and returned to her seat as if nothing had occurred. The pianist sat transfixed. The room is quiet. This was not a tantrum. This was not a royal scandal. This was significantly more perilous for the old guard. It was a princess who knew her value, and her brothers, and wasn't afraid to express it. Charlotte had just violated procedure, certainly, but in doing so, she had created a new one. For a brief period when Charlotte returned to her seat, the recital chamber at Windsor went silent, which was unusual within royal walls. Not the polite kind that comes before applause, not the awkward silence following a horrible speech. It was a startled, respectful, almost incredulous hush. Nobody knew exactly what to do. The pianist, long a beacon of elegance and skill, was obviously frightened. His fingers, which have performed on the world's most prestigious stages, twitched uncomfortably, as if wondering what they should be doing. The ambassador next to him, red-faced, looked to the floor. The performance program on his lap quickly became the most fascinating document in the room. Then came the applause. It didn't start with Louie, the prior performer, or the pianist. It came slowly at first, then all at once for Charlotte. A few timid claps from the back row led to a muted standing ovation. Not because she was a youngster who spoke up, but because she did it without malice, without theatrics, without yelling. She had held up a mirror in front of a room full of polished faces, and she had done so with the poise of someone much older. It wasn't only about dignity, it was about lineage. Princess Anne, seated toward the side of the room, leaned forward her assistant and murmured something inaudible. Her lips were firm. Her back is straight. Anne prioritized devotion to the crown over loyalty to her family. And, in her opinion, Charlotte had just crossed a perilous line. Not because she was wrong, but because she had behaved independently. Public correction, particularly by a youngster, questioned the hierarchy. It defied the silent rule. Camilla, on the other hand, expressed her dissatisfaction openly. Her eyes tightened into a familiar, trained expression, the same one she gave Diana at public appearances in the early 1990s. She moved in closer to Charles and said, "This is exactly what happens when children are raised with too much freedom." But Charles did not answer. His gaze was focused on William, whose hand was now resting on Kate's. They said nothing. They did not need to. Their daughter had just defended their youngest son in front of some of the kingdom's most prominent figures, and she had not flinched. As the event continued, the energy in the room had changed. The subsequent performances were technically sound, but emotionally subdued. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Have they just seen the future of the monarchy in action? Following the last performance, a harp solo played by a distant cousin, the pianist was supposed to cap the evening with a little improvisation. However, when his name was announced, he gently rejected it. "Perhaps another time," he answered, standing slowly and making a half bow. Nobody noticed the irony. The man who had once dominated the musical world had just been silenced, not by scandal or indignation, but by a youngster who had mastered something far more rare than music, dignity, and she delivered it with the precision of a princess who knew not only what it meant to wear a crown, but also how to defend those she cared about from others who wore theirs recklessly. Charlotte did not grin following the encounter. She didn't savor the occasion. She calmly returned to her seat, grabbed Louie's hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. Louie didn't say anything, but his shoulders loosened, his expression relaxed, because in the end, he did not require a standing ovation. He didn't require adulation from the elites. He had something far more powerful. His sister had seen him, and who stood when no one else did? If there is one thing Queen Camilla cannot tolerate, it is interruption, especially when it comes from someone younger, smarter, and more adored than herself. And on this particular evening, that disruption arrived in a navy blue dress and ballerina flats, with a voice quiet enough to hush a music hall. Camilla had kept her cool during the confrontation, as only she could. While the rest of the audience turned from amazement to appreciation, she had witnessed something very different. A 9-year-old who had broken every level of royal tradition and openly corrected a visitor. A youngster who utilized the power of truth rather than title to command the room. That made Camilla very uncomfortable. Camilla gently took one of her senior staffers aside after the recital as visitors filed into the neighboring reception room for refreshments and polite remarks. "Where is Charlotte?" she inquired, her gaze sweeping the room. "Near the fireplace, Your Majesty," the assistant said hesitantly. "She's with Prince Louie and Lady Catherine." Camilla nodded, her face inscrutable. Camilla took advantage of the occasion while Kate spoke to a small group of cultural supporters, and William checked in with a distant relative. She approached Charlotte immediately, moving into the girl's field of view with the well-planned warmth she saved for public occasions. "My dear," Camilla said, leaning gently. "A word?" Charlotte glanced up, apprehensive yet courteous. She gave Camilla a little nod and followed her into one of the side passages away from the bustle. The Queen Consort never raised her voice. She didn't need to, but her tone was chilling, and even Windsor's massive stone walls couldn't keep it in. "I realize you were unhappy," she continued cautiously, "but remember that we do not confront guests, particularly not in public. There is a time and place for everything." Charlotte did not answer quickly. She merely gazed and waited. Camilla proceeded. "You're a royal. Your responsibility is to maintain poise, even when others behave poorly." Charlotte blinked. "Even when they are insulting my brother?" Camilla's smile wavered briefly. "We rise above it," she remarked forcefully. "Royalty is not right. We persevere." Charlotte, never one to back down, responded in a calm but forceful tone. "Mummy says we're not here to impress individuals who have negative attitudes about others. We're here to teach kids how to treat others better." It was not sass. It wasn't a rebellion. It was something considerably more perilous for Camilla. Conviction. Camilla's jaws constricted. She moved closer and lowered her voice even more. "You might want to reconsider how you act in public. Princesses are seen, not heard." But before Charlotte could respond, another voice joined in. "She's heard just fine, Kate." Elegant as always, but with a tone that sliced through the air like a blade of ice. She observed the two sneaking away and silently followed them, sensing a storm forming. "She was defending her brother," Kate said, moving between them. "Something any mother or grandmother should understand." Camilla straightened up, her grin snapping back into place. "Of course, I was just—" "Are you correcting her?" Kate interjected, her eyes unwavering. "Because from where I stood, Charlotte handled herself better than most adults in that room." For a brief moment, the corridor housed 3 generations of royal women, one adhering to the old order, one defining the new, and one standing in the center, discovering who she was. Camilla retreated with a nod, but not before giving Charlotte one more glance. It wasn't quite fury. It was something colder, like recognition. The girl who had previously waved pleasantly from royal balconies was no longer a background character. She was rising, and it's rising quickly. Kate placed her hand on Charlotte's shoulder as Camilla vanished down the corridor. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Charlotte nodded. "I didn't shout," Kate grinned. "You didn't need to, because often the most powerful voices are the ones that say just enough to be heard, especially when someone wishes they hadn't said anything at all." By the time the guests had gone home and the chandeliers over Windsor had faded for the night, most people assumed the night's drama would be buried within royal walls. Just another unpleasant event in the long, silent history of palace conflicts. But Charlotte's modest disobedience produced far more than a whisper in Windsor's halls. Within 48 hours, rumors of the moment began to spread outside the castle walls. It wasn't through official declarations or public videos. Neither existed. As with most small royal gatherings, the event was private and by invitation only. But someone, an aide, a distant cousin, or a cultural patron, couldn't stop themselves. The narrative had been too unique, new, and real. The leak occurred via an anonymous statement in a cultural column tucked in the leisure section of a major London newspaper. The future queen did not wear a crown. She donned navy blue, defended her brother, and stated what no one else dared say. That single line sparked a frenzy online. Within hours, royal watchers on X, now Twitter, began scrutinizing the timeline. fan accounts began to spread unconfirmed information, each more adoring than the previous. Artists created digital images of Charlotte standing in front of a surprised crowd, and hashtags like #PrincessProtector and #CharlotteStans began trending around the UK. The report sparked something the palace hadn't anticipated, a generational shift in public opinion. For years, the monarchy strove to update its image, combining heritage with relevance. And here, without trying or having an objective, a 9-year-old child accomplished more in one performance than the firm's entire public relations apparatus had done in months. Suddenly, the future did not resemble frigid balcony waves or polished quiet. It appeared that a small girl had just stood up for her sibling. The contrast was not lost on the people. Camilla, sensing a change, issued a discreet press statement days later, complimenting the talents and creative spirit of royal children. However, it was generic, bloodless, and glaringly devoid of names. Kate, on the other hand, issued no public statement. Instead, she posted a fresh photo on the Kensington Palace Instagram account, showing Charlotte and Louie sitting at a piano, Charlotte pointing to a sheet of music with a grin and Louie laughing. What's the caption? A simple love emoji with the phrase, "Practice makes joy." It shattered the internet. People weren't simply talking about the royal family at breakfast tables, in schools, or on evening news shows. They were also talking about how they were talking about them. The concept of a little princess bravely protecting her sibling was not just heartwarming, it was transformational. What was intended to be a quiet, formal event exhibiting royalty's gentler side had ended up revealing something far more significant, a shift in the emotional guard. And whether the palace liked it or not, the public had picked a new favorite monarch, not due to her title, but because of her personality. In a monarchy where quiet is frequently associated with survival, Princess Charlotte defied convention, not by rebellion or controversy, but with clarity. Her voice was not loud, but it had weight. Her motion was little, yet it conveyed charm. She did not speak to humiliate. She talked to protect, and in doing so, she reminded the world that monarchy is not built in tiaras or titles, but rather in quiet moments, unexpected confrontations, and decisions made when no one expects you to act. For years, the people have worried about the royal family's destiny, wondering who would modernize it and who would disintegrate beneath it. But no one expected a 9-year-old child, with her mother's love and grandmother's fortitude, to be the one to show them everything. Charlotte did not breach royal custom, she polished it, reclaimed it, because while many regarded her as the spare to the heir, she demonstrated something more profound. She is the quiet amid the pandemonium, the compass in the storm, and most all, the sister who stood when even the grown-ups sat. That night in Windsor was meant to be about music. However, the genuine performance did not originate from a piano. It came from a princess who reworked the melody and sang a unique tune that the world will never forget.